George Herbert Walker Bush was born in Milton, Massachusetts on June 12, 1924. He grew up in a family of entirely politicians, which led him to develop a strong leadership personality. During his school years, he was a student leader at Phillips Academy in Andover. At the age of 18, George Herbert W. Bush enlisted into the Army. He was the youngest pilot in the Navy at the time. After being in the military and receiving many medals, he focused on education. He became a Yale student and majored in economics. After Yale, Bush became interested in politics, such as his family. He ran unsuccessfully for Senate twice before receiving countless of jobs, such as ambassador to the United Nations and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. In 1980, he won the election as vice president to Ronald Reagan. He was vice president for 8 years, and then in 1988, he won the election to become the 41st president of the United States.
Bush's domestic policy was one of memorable proportions in that it was very strong, unlike past presidents. He mainly wanted to have a limited agenda, which consisted of an increase in volunteerism, education reform, and anti-drug and crime programs. Originally, Bush had pledged in his campaign that as a Republican candidate, he would not raise taxes. But after encountering conflict from a Democratic-dominated Congress, a compromise had to be made. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990 reduced deficit in the United States by cutting the expenditures of the government and raising the taxes of the people. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was passed after issues between the people and the disabled in the workplace rose. It made it illegal to discriminate against disabled employees and also guaranteed them places of business, public venues, and means of transportation. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1990 as a result of the incident where an Exxon Valdez oil tank spilled thousands of gallons of oil into the Prince William Sound in Alaska. The main goals of the act were to reduce urban smog, lessen acid rain, and eliminate industrial emissions of toxic chemicals.
During his presidency, President Bush devoted much of his time to foreign affairs, an area over which presidents generally have more latitude than they do with domestic affairs. In his first inaugural address, Bush spoke of unity between the executive and legislative branches in foreign affairs, presenting a united front to the rest of the world and referring to a time when our differences ended at the water's edge. He also put together a team of advisors, including National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, Secretary of State James Baker, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell, who generally worked well together. Panama. In the 1980s, Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega, a once U.S. supportive leader who was later accused of spying for Fidel Castro and using Panama to traffic drugs into the U.S. Soviet Union. In 1989, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Bush met with Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev in a conference on a Military island of Malta. Gulf of War. On August 2, 1990, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded its oil-rich neighbor to the south, Kuwait. Bush condemned invasion and began real opposition to Iraq in the U.S. and among European, Asian, and Middle Eastern allies. NAFTA. Bush's administration, along with the progressive, conservative Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, spearheaded the negotiations to the North American Free Trade Agreement.
G.H.W. Bush, the 41st president, was one of the most qualified presidents to ever come into office. With his experience as a vice president and high level of education, he was more than prepared for the job. This led him to have a long career in both domestic and foreign affairs, in which he focused much more on foreign. Bush was moderate conservative. He didn't like dramatic changes. His calm nature led him to aid us in the downfall of the Soviet Union after the Cold War. By not robbing in victory, we were protected from backlash. He became very involved in important notions, which brought success to our country. He sent troops to Panama to overthrow the regime of Manuel Noriega, who threatened the canal. One of his greatest tests was against Iraq President Saddam Hussein, who took over Kuwait. Bush rallied troops to free them. He was also involved in many more foreign successes, but there was still discontent. Critics believed that Bush was not involved enough in domestic affairs. He advocated a strong purpose in his inauguration address, but it fell through. He alienated the more conservative wing of the Republican Party by breaking his promise not to raise taxes and cutting down military spending. High deficit spending continued, the economy faltered, and violence rose during his presidency. Bush didn't win the re-election due to America's disappointment in the area of domestic affairs, but his legacy is still continuing. With his son, whom also became president, it has allowed for a reflective period on this family. George H.W. Bush had a great run in foreign affairs, especially during the Persian Gulf War, of which he is highly credited to today.